Hi, Terry Bolt here. This is a talk I'd rather not be giving, but it's important, and so I feel I have to give it. This is on academic integrity, misconduct, talking about plagiarism and what's okay and what's not is most of this talk. This is based on a talk by Erika Gavillet at Watson Library at Newcastle University in the UK, this has been adapted and is being presented by Terry Bolt at UCCS. So let's start about what's going to happen. You're going on, you're trying to get your PhD, you're getting an advanced degree, and a big part of what you're going to get out of this is your credentials, your reputation. To quote one of my favorite business authors, it takes 20 years to build a reputation, 5 minutes to ruin it. If you think about that, you'll do things differently. You got to be very careful with your reputation. It's one of the most important things you're going to build as an academic, and you've got to worry about what that's going to look like. One serious issue of academic misconduct and your career as an academic is pretty much over. So what is academic misconduct? So cheating is the one as a student you've been aware of, students cheating on exams and whatever. And that's hopefully a thing of the past for you. You don't have that much regular academic coursework to do, but it's still a potential. But cheating on anything is going to be a problem. But now the bigger problem for you is plagiarism and misappropriation of the works of another. And I'll spend a lot more of today's talk on that. So there's also the potential for falsification of data, where you literally make up stuff to put in your paper. Unless you think it doesn't happen in science, there's regularly 1 to 2 cases a year of somebody losing their academic job over falsification of data. Major journals end up publishing a paper, somebody figures it out. I have some friends of mine who are doing academic research on the automatic detection of both plagiarism and the falsification of data. Both of these are really big problems. Another one is improperly obtaining or representing laboratory or field data, stealing data, but sometimes it's asking somebody for data but then not properly including where it came from in your stuff. There's other types of dishonesty in publication where you don't necessarily are not honest about what you know. So if you know something doesn't work and you publish a paper that says it does, even though you have experimental results to show it doesn't, that's a kind of dishonesty. Publication or attempted publication of collaborative work without the permission of the other participant. If you have somebody that been working with you on this, they should probably be, at least ask if they feel they should be an author. A number of you put my name on your survey papers. I probably have not risen to the level of co-author on the survey papers. I really don't belong there. But it's good that you at least try to include me because you don't want to include it without the permission. We've actually had students who wanted to publish stuff and I said, no, the work is not ready. You can't publish it. And they went ahead and published it anyhow. One did it with my name, one did it without my name. But in either way is it good if you try and publish that kind of work. Abuse of confidentiality. If somebody tells you something in confidence, you can't necessarily report it. This is especially critical in human subject research, but it can be true in almost any context. The misuse of computer facilities, using computers. Well, I have a lab with a lot of GPUs in it. I've actually had students ask me why I don't do Bitcoin mining because Bitcoin mining is not consistent with my research, right? I don't misuse computer facilities. The same would be true if I tried to use somebody else's computers without their permission for my own actual research. Misuse of human subjects, anything that violates your human subject protocols would be a problem with that. During COVID, we've had to be very careful with our human subject experiments to make sure we're looking after the safety of everyone wearing gloves and masks and things like that. Misuse of vertebrate animals, again, if you do animal research, you do that, not so common for computer science. Illegally or carelessly obtaining or using dangerous substances or providing such substances to others, again, particularly difficult with human subjects. If you're in the medical field, not so much of an issue for us. Falsification or unauthorized modification of academic record, going in, hacking the computer to change your grades, obviously not a big issue for most academics after they graduate, but that would be true if you did it for one of your students as well, and so it's something to think about. Obstruction of the academic activities of another, so intentionally stopping someone else from being able to do their research, unless they're doing something inappropriate, and in which case you're standing up for academic conduct, then you could talk about it. But and there's other forms of academic misconduct that are commonly called out within the fields of your scientific, in a particular scientific community. For example, if you're a medical researcher, not listing your funding sources in some areas is considered unethical. You're supposed to say, if you got money from a company, they might benefit from it, you have to disclose it. Most universities have conflict of interest policies you'll have to deal with. Most companies have conflict of interest policies. Violating any of those would also be academic misconduct. Sort of another level removed is aiding or abetting academic misconduct by others or attempted academic misconduct on your point of view. And one of the things that's important to note for almost everything on this list, one or two exceptions, if you violate these rules, you actually run the risk of losing your job. And I would say every year there's 2 to 3 cases of someone losing their job in academia because of this, and even more cases in computer science in industry. Unless you think it doesn't happen at very high levels. A couple of years ago, there was a major Chinese company for whom sort of some combination of falsification of data, but more or less dishonesty in publication and misuse of computer facilities, where they were found cheating in a competition, a major competition, and it caused multiple people in the organization to get fired, all the way up to the vice president who was in charge of the computer science research, because they were aware of the problem and they were not stopping it. So this idea of aiding or abetting can still be enough reason for you to lose your job. So, but the biggest reason to do all these things isn't because you're afraid of losing your job, it's because you're trying to do good science and you want to follow through that with. So academic dishonesty or academic integrity is really a dilemma. You want to show you've done your work, but you want to write something new and original. You want to appeal to the experts in authority, but you also want to improve upon or disagree with experts in authorities, right? So you have to relate your work to other people's, but you have to make sure you're doing that right. So you want to demonstrate your ability to write by mimicking what you hear and read, but you really have to use your own words and your own voice. You can't just take text, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. You should be giving credit where credit is due, but make your own significant contribution, right? So in the first slide of this, I meant this is who I got these slides from. I've left them largely intact, but there's been a number of places where I added things. I'm not sure in this case it's my own significant contribution. I wouldn't think this rises to the level of a publication, but it does rise to the level of a lecture. And within academia, when you are doing research and when you're doing teaching, there's a special carve out in copyright law, what's called fair use for academic. And so within that scope, I can reuse materials as long as I've honestly said where I got it from, and I'm not personally making a lot of money out of it, then I can argue that that's fair use for academic things, which is what I'm going through here. Okay, and I did talk about the job. So you have to remember that supervisors, other readers, other academics will not be able to tell if your plagiarism is deliberate or not. If you meant to quote somebody and you don't put quotes around it, they can't tell if you're trying to get away with something or not. Either way, it's either sloppy or deliberately misleading, and either of those is enough reason for most employers to say you shouldn't be here anymore. So take some time to make sure you're doing this. When you're taking your notes, make sure you keep track. If I cut and paste a whole paragraph of text, meaning to rewrite it later, do it in such a way that when you go to see it later, you can't help but recognize that I need to rewrite this. So what is plagiarism? Plagiarism is the expression that improperly and deceptively incorporates existing work either without authorization or without documentation or both. So the limits of deception are relative to the context in which ideas, knowledge, and information are communicated. So it doesn't really apply to things like ghostwriting or advertising or open source software. Lots of open source stuff, including various open source slides and text, can be distributed under Creative Commons licenses that give you the right to reuse it as long as you cite it and various things like that. So this is a definition of plagiarism, but it's a pretty good one. And the really key things are it's improperly and deceptively, without authorization, or without documentation, or both. Now notice that it doesn't say intentionally. So if I improperly do something that makes it so that people can't recognize that it's happening, that is plagiarism, even if I didn't intend it. There's no necessarily intent in plagiarism, as long as you've improperly and deceptively incorporated it. You can read the word deceptive as intention, but you can actually deceptively do things by just running it with other text, and you didn't mean to, but you forgot. Well, that's still deceptive. So lest you think that this is hard to detect, today almost every major journal, most major conferences that I'm aware of all use software. So there's a bunch of software, I'll go through some in just a second, that are really good at detecting plagiarism. Every paper you turned in this class has gone through a plagiarism detector. And you can actually get the reports when you turned it in. Most journals now and many books are watermarking all of their figures. So if you try and steal a figure, there's something you can't see, but when they go to analyze it digitally, they'll be able to detect it. And internet detection software is growing in the ability to go out and do this. And then some of this is experienced for the students who had problems with plagiarism in their drafts for their survey paper. I detected them because they didn't sound right. And then I went back and looked at the plagiarism software. I don't count on the plagiarism software. I use it when I think there's an issue. But when I'm running a conference and I've got, as an editor of a journal, or when I'm running a conference and I have hundreds of papers, I count on that software to do a lot of the detection. So one of the tools that you can use is turnitin.com. That's actually what our campus uses. And so each of your things went through this. And it's important because it detects a very broad range of stuff. Just because Turnitin detects something does not mean it's plagiarism. For example, all of you have included a bunch of references. Most of them are properly formatted references. And even if you typed in the reference by hand from scratch, it's supposed to be in a standard form. So that's not plagiarism to have your references match other people's references. But when paragraphs of text or even sentences of text start matching exactly, that becomes a problem. Another one, which is actually the one we use within IEEE for our conferences, is Authenticate, which also gives out similar kinds of reports. There's a couple other companies out there as well. So what are the sort of types of things? And so this is based on University of South-based websites, acceptable, unacceptable uses of non-original material from back in 2008. But these were some nice examples, so I'll sort of just continue on with them. They're from the slides that I got from Newcastle. So copy and paste. This is the most blatant. The writer copies the exact words that have already been published into their work without any indication of their origin. So if this is the original text, you can sort of read the first sentence or two and get a feel for what's going on. And then this is what somebody else included, right? In this essay, I'll explain why and whatever, and then just has the rest of the paragraph. This is absolute copy and paste. And every tool out there will easily detect this kind of stuff because it's really easy to detect this kind of stuff. So then people feel, well, these tools will automatically detect all this. I'll go through some disguise. Some words are changed from the original source. In fact, at a minimum, if I go back, you might notice these references are in a particular style. Right? If I were to copy and paste this and I needed to change the style, I would change the style of the BibTeX file. Right? You'd have to be careful because first you have to have proper site and citation so you can fill them all in. Another classic problem is that when people are copying and pasting, they miss formatting things that change, and you have to be careful about that. So as a disguise, it takes a little bit more effort to rewrite a few words here and there. And this is, oddly enough, it makes it very clear that there's a very deliberate attempt to pass the work off as the writer's own, and this makes it, for many places, even worse. So if you take a few sentences here and there and rewrite it, so here you sort of see the things that have been crossed out and replaced with a few other things, but you can sort of see all of the text that is left alone is still incredibly the same. So the black text was added, the orange text was copied, and the orange text that's been crossed out has been crossed out, so it's showing you editing. This would still be detected by every tool we use for doing things. Another is incorrect referencing, where it's not made clear where the writer's work belongs with the right taken from the original source. So in this one, so you have a sentence or two, then you have according to Coltwin 2004, which is where that thing was taken, and then you have this long block of text. This is inappropriate, even though you have a citation here. You don't actually say what sentences or what phrases came from them. Anything that's a sentence or longer should absolutely be quoted if you're including it from a paper. Key phrases should be as well if they're really important phrases that you're trying to talk about, but this is still incorrect referencing, again, easily detected by all of our tools. So what's called a mosaic is a little bit more difficult. It's fragments of the original text that are scattered between parts where the writer's written, which is somewhere like the disguise one, right? Mosaic is just more aggressive. It becomes more complicated when the ideas and sequences are lifted from the original source with 2 or 3 sources mixed together, which is why it's often called a mosaic. You might take things from 2 or 3 people and put them together. But really, the writer's comments had no value and make no difference to the writing. So this is all from one particular place, but you can sort of see you have sentences or two from one place, then you have sentences from another, and you go back and forth. So it's another kind of disguise. And with those multiple sources where the context mixed from more than one source, it doesn't actually make anything any more original. It's right. So if I took it, maybe do it in, like here I have a paragraph from one and a paragraph from another. This is still absolute plagiarism. Every tool will find all of this stuff, right? So not only should you not do it because it's wrong, but everything I've shown you in these paragraphs before, these are all easily detectable by modern tools, and they will detect it. So the next level is sort of the minimum, and many students were taught in high school about this idea of paraphrasing. So in this example, nearly all the words are those of the writer. However, the sequence of ideas, the references to support the arguments are identical to its original source. So, and if you go back and read it, you'll see that this is significantly different at the word level. This is unlikely to be detected as plagiarism by most of the automated software, but it's detectable by some because they're getting better at deciding what are actually the meaning as they get towards the meaning, and deciding the sequence of meanings is the same. This is more likely to be caught by an experienced editor who says, this is something I've read before. And that might sound crazy, but for editors who read lots and lots of papers, they become pretty good at saying, this sounds like what I read last year, and then they'll go look it up and sort of find that. There's no attempt to mislead or to cheat. You correctly put stuff in there, but there's so little of the writer's work that it's pointless. And in fact, depending on what you took out of them, if it's correctly acknowledged, as this one was, right? So this has got references in from it, but it doesn't actually list the original source. So this would be a questionable one in my view. Of course, you can also do correct but inappropriate usage with a giant block of quotes, right? So here's according to the reference and then this big block of text. When you're doing quotes, anything more than 2 lines should be set out as a paragraph like this is, where it's indented, so it's clearer that it's a quote. You don't just count on the quotation marks to stuff long things in there. So when should you give credit? Well, obviously when you're referring to someone else's words or ideas, you should give credit. When you use the information gathered from interviewing somebody, or if you're doing work where you actually do human subjects and you interview them, you should be quoting them. You might have to do it as an anonymous quote if you're protecting their identity. Anytime you reproduce or reprint any diagrams, illustrations, charts, or photos, and at this point, you almost always want to make sure you actually have explicit permission. So you can quote a line out of a paper without the author's permission. If you're going to use their figures, you absolutely want to have their permission, or more importantly, the publisher's permission. If they publish it in an ACM or an IEEE conference, you have to get IEEE or ACM's permission to reuse that figure. Many of you in your survey papers have copies of figures from papers, and if you're using exactly that, you need to have explicit written permission, or you might get sued. That's worse in some sense, because it's beyond plagiarism, it's copyright infringement, which has legal implications. Secondly, if you're going to do any of those things, the credit should be given in the caption of the figure, not buried somewhere down in the text. Anytime it's using exact words or unique phrases from another person's work that are not well established in the field, you should, the first time, quote, put quotes around it and a citation for them. So if you want to make sure you're safe, here's some techniques to make sure you can't be accused of plagiarism. So when you're taking notes, make sure you put a Q in the margin anytime you just copy and paste quotes. Or if you're doing electronically, you might, for example, put it in a different font or a different color, so you're very clear this is a quote from this paper. And there's nothing wrong with when you're taking notes and doing your reading, your detailed reading of paper, to take some quotes. Some quotes are good in your paper, because especially when you're starting out, you don't have a lot of credibility to make a very bold statement. Somebody else has, you can use their quoted materials to make that. Keep a full record of your sources, page numbers, titles, anything you're using like that. Always acknowledge in your final text using in-text citations, the kind of stuff we do, footnotes, bibliography, those kinds of things you want to do. When paraphrasing or summarizing, very important for those, in your summary papers, your survey papers, there's a little bit of summarizing. But again, your survey paper is not supposed to be a summary of paper, it's supposed to be a survey looking at higher level things. But the best way to do that is write your paraphrase from memory. Don't look at the original text. Then you can go back and check it for accuracy. But if you're looking at the text as you try and write, you tend to get too close to the text, which will give you a problem. In your work, you can start this up by giving credit according to the author's name. It's bad if you have a long paragraph or a paragraph of material and a bunch of citations directly after it, because you don't say what you took from them. And if they're many pages long and you have a sentence or two, that's not fair to the readers for you to say what you're taking from them. If you have just one, it may not be so bad if you've talked about it a lot, but talk about giving the author's name and putting that kind of stuff in there. And if you want to have unique phrases, give them appropriate quotes as well. So you don't want to use too many. It starts to look like there's not many of your own ideas in your work. In survey papers, there can be a little bit more of it because you're talking about the important phrases from them. It's okay. But your real work in a survey paper is about the interpretation and the connection of ideas across papers, not the idea in a paper. Your value of a survey paper isn't that you could summarize what was in a paper, but that you could connect this paper to 3 or 4 others and give a new insight to the reader than they might have gotten otherwise. Mention the author somewhere, use quotations. If you take a sentence or more, it must be quoted. Critical phrases probably should as well. So a little bit of quiz here at the end. So you're under pressure with your lab experiments. Which goes wrong? Your colleagues ran a similar experiment last week, gives you the figures to include in your report. Is this an acceptable practice? Is this plagiarism? Is this collusion? Let's see a second. Okay, so this one's a little tricky because I didn't quite give you enough, but I would say this one's collusion. Come on. This is collusion because you worked with somebody, right, and you put them in the report. Now, if they're a co-author of the report, then that's not a problem, but the way it's phrased, I didn't say whether or not they were. So if you're going to use that in your report, then they need to be a co-author, right? So you're going to include them, fine, make them a co-author or talk about what they contributed. At a bare minimum, if they contribute to your paper, even just by giving you feedback, it's good to have them in the acknowledgement section, but figures rise to the level of co-authorship. If they designed the figures, they ran an experiment, it's their data, their figures, they're a co-author. If someone takes your data and helps you make a pretty picture out of it, then you say, I want it to look like this, and they do that, that's not a co-author. That might be an acknowledgement, it might not even be anything, depends on what level and what the relationship is. Okay, so when you're writing your research, you take short phrases from a number of sources, add your own words, make it a coherent structure, and list all the sources in bibliography. Is this acceptable practice? Is this plagiarism? Is this collusion? So if you take short phrases, even if you add your own words in the middle, this is plagiarism. Okay, you found a fantastic article, you copy a few sentences of it word for word, include quotation marks and an in-text citation, include all the full details in your bibliography. Is this acceptable practice, plagiarism, or collusion? Well, if the few sentences aren't too big, then this is acceptable practice. And in some fields, even if it's whole paragraphs, it can be acceptable practice because you're analyzing the text of what they said. But keep it to a few. Okay, so you want to give, you use a graph from a textbook. You contact the author, they give you permission, and you reference it in your bibliography. Is this acceptable practice, plagiarism, or collusion? Okay, so this one's a little trickier. Okay, so this is actually probably still plagiarism for 2 reasons. The author and the publisher have to give you permission, but even if they both gave you permission, if all you do is references in your bibliography, that is still plagiarism. You need to put the citation to it in the caption of the figure and or in the text, but it should be in the caption of the figure. So it gives you a couple things to think about. This is not core computer science. This is true for all kinds of science. I borrowed these slides from somebody else who'd already talked about this stuff because it was easier for me. I had to do this pretty quickly. I didn't have time to make up all my own slides. But because I gave the citations, right? Even though in this case, I can't put quotes of all their slides in the middle of my talk, I started the talk saying I took it for them. And from an academic fair use point of view, that's acceptable. But thanks again to the people at Newcastle whose slides I borrowed from.